Hi, so in this section we're going to talk about combat with your voices, which is very similar to winning arguments. The goal is to create an ecosystem where you talk only to the voices that you like, on topics that you enjoy, and only when nothing else is going on. Winning arguments with your voices, getting agreements that you can enforce, or preventing them from using abilities takes time to get good at, but there are tools that can help. With that said, combat with your voices should really be a last resort. The more conflict you have, the more often you're fighting, the harder it will be to focus on your physical life, and as a rule, the more negative your experience will become. So where you can, look for diplomacy and peace and harmony and all those things as your first choice. But if your voices really refuse to be a positive ecosystem with you, it may be necessary to use combat. So in this section, we're going to talk about something called engineering, which is really for the people whose voices claim to have abilities or who feel that they themselves have abilities with their voices. Now, again, we've pretty much confirmed as a voice hearing community that we will never physically meet one of our voices, and their claims of being able to influence your physical life are largely bluffs, lies, or their own confusion. But for some people, their voices do have the ability to influence the storyline and character traits of their voice ecosystem. Now, in the medical model, this makes sense just because if your subconscious expects something, it will create that kind of storyline. And in all other models, there's different ways of explaining why this happens. When talking about engineering or the use of abilities with your voices, the other key term is manifestation, which is how the abilities play out. So for example, let's say your voice engineered that you and the voice will be in harmony. The manifestation could be you singing a pop song together, which is different than what was intended with the ability. And that's why we talk about manifestation as a separate thing that happens with abilities. Probably the most important part of using engineering with your voices, if you or they claim to have abilities, is to think about combat as an extension of your own creativity and logic. In all cases, you're having an argument with your voices, trying to get to agreements, and sometimes there's powers involved. In no cases are you having a battle of powers that sometimes has an argument. Even in the cases of a spiritual model or model that really does have abilities, if you can convince your voices to behave a certain way, then they will not use those abilities to damage your ecosystem. So really think about combat as an argument first. For some of you, you may have abilities involved, or at least the claim of abilities, and rely on your logic and creativity more than your abilities. One thing to add is that if you do have abilities with your voices that can influence strictly the storylines of your voice ecosystem, you don't actually have to know why something works in order to enjoy the benefits. Meaning, if you can have the ability to put up shields so that your voices don't force your attention, for example, great, feel free to use that ability. Normally speaking, when you understand the logic of why an ability works, it will perform better. But it's not actually necessary. With that said, stay grounded. Again, your abilities will not be able to influence the physical world. They're more likely to influence the thoughts and behaviors between you and your voices, which is very similar to winning an argument or reaching an agreement between yourself and the voices. So with that, I want to talk a bit more about abilities and those of you who can use engineering to influence your ecosystem. Although every voice hearing experience is unique, there are certain patterns, and understanding these patterns can really give you an edge against your voices. For example, when you communicate with your voices, do you send data to them? Do you send your voices to data? Or do you just change things in your ecosystem, and then when your voices interact with it, things play out differently? I'll give you some examples. Let's say that you're breaking a hostile voice's shield in order to do some damage to it. That's sending data to your voice. If you're connecting your voices to each other so that they can talk and figure out some harmony, that's sending your voices to data. If you simply change the rules of your ecosystem so that whenever a voice steals information from you, your allies will get some of their information back. That's changing data in your ecosystem. So again, one of the standardizations is, do you send data? Do you move around your voices? Or do you just change your ecosystem? So another standardization for those of you that have abilities between you and your voices is something called short form, long form, or mid form engineering. So for example, short form engineering is where something happens exactly once. If a voice throws a fire attack at you and you negate it or prevent it from happening, that's short form engineering. You did something that happened exactly once. Long form engineering is setting rules in your ecosystem. So every time a voice attacks me, something bad will happen to it. Or every time that a voice defends me, it will be rewarded with additional information from you. These are rules in your ecosystem and are an example of long form engineering. The recommendation is usually to avoid both of these and to focus on mid form engineering, which is, like the name implies, something in the middle. Say, for example, you put up a shield so that your voices can't force your attention when you're within 10 feet of a loved one. Well, you put up the shield exactly once, which is similar to short form engineering, but the shield plays out forever unless a hostile voice breaks it, which is similar to long form engineering. Unlike long form engineering, if a voice breaks your shield, there's no rule in place that will create a new one. So mid form engineering is using any ability so that it will play out indefinitely, but will not be a rule that happens every single time. When you use long form engineering, there's a high chance of creating tangles in your ecosystem between all of the different rules and how they play out. So the recommendation is to lean on mid form engineering wherever you can. Probably the most important standardization for those of you whose voices have abilities or who feel that you have abilities with your voice ecosystem is the type of manifestation. What I mean is that you don't want your engineering to specifically force your voices to think or behave a certain way. Instead, you want to focus on their opportunities or their cost benefit. Using engineering to make one of your voices good is likely going to backfire and to not work. Creating a shield such that anytime your voice attacks, it loses reputation with your voice allies, focuses on its opportunities, and is overall better for harmony in your ecosystem. There's all sorts of other standardizations for engineering, the time between when you use an ability and when it plays out, or the strength of it if you're just putting a voice completely on mute if you have that ability, or just making it a bit less present. But that covers most of it. The last thing I will say for those of you who have abilities is don't use more than 4 different abilities to achieve a goal. You always want to have some extra moves in your back pocket in case a voice undoes your work, or if something starts to play out differently than how you wanted it. Remember again the example of engineering harmony and ending up singing a duet. With that, also, if something is really important, don't use only one ability, but try to approach it from a few different angles. Lastly, again, for those of you who have abilities with your voices, it makes sense that it actually affects your storyline in all models, whether in the medical model you're setting your subconscious expectations, or in the telepathy model you're influencing the relationship, or in all other models where it might be a bit more literal. But still, you're fundamentally arguing with the use of abilities involved. You are not having a superpower conflict that sometimes has an argument. It's very important to understand the difference. Lean on your own creativity, your own wit. If you happen to be able to influence your ecosystem in some unexplained way, feel free to use it. Why not? Lastly, if you happen to have abilities with your voices to influence the ecosystem, have fun. Every single word can, in theory, achieve an impact. For example, air guitar against your voices can get through their shields because it's not making a sound. And then you activate the music you were playing to create some sort of impact. Yo-yos can get through enemy shields, collect information, and come back. It doesn't actually matter why something works. If you can influence your ecosystem, then go for it. With that said, combat with your voices is a lot more about influencing their perspectives, their emotions, their opportunities, or their cost benefit. You want to win an argument with your voices so that they will behave in a way that is positive for your ecosystem. That means thinking about what motivates them and how you can navigate their situation and their agenda to being in harmony with your goals. One example of using abilities with cost-benefit in mind could be that every time a voice attacks you, it will have its reputation take damage with other voices. Its secrets will be revealed. Or using a prison function so that your voice learns the importance of not bothering busy people and has a new perspective on how to behave in harmony. Overall, the goal of combat with your voices is to achieve the most possible impact with the least amount of your own time and effort. To do this, you should really focus on identifying your own long-term goals for the ecosystem and being very deliberate with the arguments that you have with your voices. Also, since you are arguing with your voices, maintain the moral high ground. The more that your voice ecosystem knows that you are the moral one, the harder it will be for hostile voices to frame you or to do damage to your reputation. In the previous section, we talked about the different kinds of conflict that can happen with voices, where they can attack your happiness or your attention, where they can use abilities and feel threatening, or even influence your biology with urges and impulses. We also talked about the different kinds of motivations that hostile voices can have. They can attack you because of their own pain and suffering, for some petty crime reason to steal information or to harass you, for their own political agendas, for power hunger, or because they think that you're actually the one in their story. In addition to these, if you are having combat with hostile voices, it can really help you to build more complicated profiles. For example, you can have a character such as Samuel, who uses deals to influence the rest of your voices against you. For this kind of profile, all you have to do is prove that Samuel breaks his deals, and all the voices that are being influenced against you will no longer put their effort to helping Samuel. In this way, you could organize not only the reasons why voices attack, or the types of attacks that they use, but the broader profile for how they achieve their agenda. As another example, we talked about voices that benefit when you label parts of yourself as them. This is a method for how a voice gains power in your ecosystem. On the whole, organizing your storyline into convenient profiles is more important than accurately labeling and identifying every single voice that you may have. With that said, sometimes one voice will behave like a Samuel profile and will try to gain influence through deals. Another time, this same voice may be a different profile that believes in capitalism and tries to promote free will in your ecosystem. If you organize your ecosystem according to character profiles, allow voices to be flexible with which profile they remind you of. Again, the goal is to be able to achieve as much impact as you can with as little of your own time and effort. So, depending on how a voice reminds you of a character, you can know the best way to respond. With all of that said, try to build individual relationships with your voice allies, just as a matter of courtesy. The more voice allies you have, the easier it will be to defend your ecosystem. For those of you who really have abilities between you and your voices that can influence the ecosystem, have many voices, or are looking to learn more about how to best use voice allies, this section in my book goes into a lot more detail about team engineering and assigning missions, and how to really maximize the use of combat to achieve a goal. With that, feel free to visit my website, lifewithvoices.com, for frequently asked questions, to talk more on the forum, purchase my book at Amazon. Also, the standardization of these tools took over a decade, but I do want to make sure that they're available for free to anyone who needs it. That's why I make these videos. If you found value in these videos, please leave a donation, also at lifewithvoices.com. It really allows me to keep helping the movement. In the next section, we'll talk about ecosystem and how to build harmony deliberately with your voices.